Hey there, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're all about the latest climate news, and we've got a really interesting mix of sources to unpack.
Absolutely. We're talking about wildfire aftermath in LA, political battles over energy policy, and even some surprising stuff about those clouds.
Okay, so let's dive right in. We can't ignore those images of the wildfires in Los Angeles. What are the lasting impacts beyond just the immediate damage?
Well, it's important to remember that the effects go way beyond the initial flames. We're talking thousands of structures gone, which obviously means economic fallout, displacement of residents, and puts a strain on the housing market.
It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And the insurance industry, I read that they're facing a reckoning.
Yeah, that's a big takeaway here. Insurers are having to reevaluate their risk models, which means premiums could skyrocket not just in California, but potentially everywhere. Some experts even think that certain areas might become uninsurable.
Wow, that's a scary thought. It makes you think about how we rebuild and if we can make things more resilient to these fires.
It is the big question, right? There's a growing feeling that we need to be using fire-resistant building materials and really rethink landscaping choices.
That makes sense. But we were reading about how stuff like plastics can have a huge impact on fire intensity.
Oh, yeah. Research shows that all the plastics in our homes now, like furniture foam and vinyl flooring, can make fires way worse. They ignite faster and create more toxic smoke.
So it's like all our choices had these consequences. It's a domino effect. And while firefighters were battling those flames in LA, politics is heating up around climate change too.
For sure, Trump's energy secretary nominee, Chris Wright, has been getting a lot of heat for some old social media posts where he downplayed the severity of wildfires, called it all hype. It sparked a lot of debate.
And Biden's climate policies are facing scrutiny from both sides too, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth about the Inflation Reduction Act. Some say it's a huge win, others say it doesn't go far enough. And then there's the whole debate about oil drilling in Alaska. Biden's putting in limits, but the Republicans are pushing back.
It's like a constant tug of war. But it's happening against the backdrop of real climate impacts being felt across the globe. What are some of the stories that have caught your eye?
Well, the situation in Suriname is really concerning. Severe droughts have caused water levels to plummet, and it's messed up the river life there. Now there are shortages of food and water, and it's hitting the communities that rely on that river really hard.
It just shows that climate change is already affecting people in very real ways. And it's not just far-off places. There's also the endangered salmon in the Pacific Northwest. They're facing challenges because of the dams.
Exactly. It's a tough one. It highlights the balance we need to find between our needs and protecting those ecosystems. We get hydropower from dams, but they also disrupt the rivers, which can be bad news for the salmon and other
It
species.
seems like everything is connected. Before we get into solutions, I'm curious about that study on the unexpected effects of clouds on global warming.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one. The research suggests that changes in clouds are actually helping to lessen the warming a bit. Specifically, there's been a reduction in low cloud cover over land, which has a slight cooling effect.
So some good news from the clouds, but I'm guessing that doesn't mean we're out of the woods.
Definitely not. Climate change is still a huge problem, but it does show how complex the Earth's climate system is and how much we still don't know. It shows how important it is to keep doing research and figure out those feedback loops.
Okay, so a complex and ever-changing situation. But let's shift gears now and talk about some of those hopeful stories, those innovations and adaptations that give us reason to be optimistic. Where do we start?
Well, I think Norway's electric vehicle adoption is a fantastic example of what's possible with the right policies. They've really made EVs a real option for a lot of people.
They're way ahead of the U.S.
They are, for sure, and it's working. EV sales are through the roof. It shows you can make a dent in those emissions if we work at it.
Okay, that's encouraging. What about clean hydrogen? There's been so much talk about it, but I'm not sure I get it.
It's definitely a hot topic, and the Biden administration just finalized those tax credits to push cleaner production. The thing is, we need to be making hydrogen with renewable energy sources, things like wind, solar, maybe even nuclear.
So it's not just about hydrogen itself, but how we get it.
Exactly, and that's where it gets tricky. There are different ways to produce hydrogen, and some are way cleaner than others. These new rules are meant to favor the cleanest ways, but there's been pushback from industry groups. They're worried about meeting those standards.
So another political battle brewing.
It could be. There's a lot at stake here with those tax credits. Industry groups want the rules to be doable, while environmental advocates want the strictest standards possible to really get those emissions down.
It's all a balancing act.
Okay.
But while that's happening, it's great to see communities taking action themselves to deal with climate change. What are we seeing there?
Well, Albuquerque, New Mexico is doing some cool stuff. They're putting a lot into cycling infrastructure, making it safer to bike, and hopefully getting people out of their cars.
Interesting. So it's not always about these big technological fixes, but also about changing how we do things at the local level.
Exactly. Though it isn't always easy. There's also the EPA, and they're facing challenges in getting environmental justice to those communities hit hardest by pollution. Biden's Justice 40 initiative was supposed to address this, but many are still waiting for real change.
It shows that turning policy into action can be slow and tough.
It takes a lot of effort, community involvement, and holding those in power accountable. And speaking of accountability, there's been some concern about potential conflicts of interest in the new administration.
Right, I read about that. Something about oil industry people at an inauguration party.
Exactly. Billionaire oil executive Harold Hamm had a private event, and it raised some eyebrows. People are worried about it influencing policy decisions.
It definitely adds fuel to the fire for those worried about climate action under Trump.
It's definitely something to watch. Trump has already said he wants to roll back those environmental regulations and push fossil fuels.
Yeah.
This just makes those concerns stronger.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part. We've seen the devastating impacts of climate change, the political battles over energy policy, and some hopeful signs with those innovative solutions and communities stepping up.
It's a complex and constantly changing landscape, but staying informed and engaged is so important. There's so much at stake, and every action, no matter how small, can help us build a more sustainable future. Welcome back to our deep dive on all things climate.
It's really interesting to see how this is all playing out globally. We were just talking about Norway and those electric vehicles. What other innovative approaches are out there?
Well, clean hydrogen is getting a lot of attention. We talked about those Biden tax credits earlier, right? The ones
Right.
to encourage cleaner production. There's still a lot of debate around that whole hydrogen thing.
You mentioned how hydrogen production can be good or bad for the environment. Could you break that down? What makes some methods cleaner than others?
Sure thing. So they have this color coding system that helps. Green hydrogen is made using renewables like wind and solar power. That's the cleanest way. Then you've got blue hydrogen, which uses natural gas, but they try to capture and store the carbon emissions. So it's better, but some people worry about how well that carbon capture actually works, and it can be expensive too. And then there's gray hydrogen, which is the most common way, but also the worst for the environment because it uses fossil fuels without dealing with the emissions.
That color coding makes things so much clearer. So those tax credits are designed to push for the green and blue hydrogen, right?
Exactly. The goal is to move away from that dirty gray hydrogen and get the industry to be more sustainable. But of course, not everyone agrees on how to do that.
I can imagine. What are some of the arguments you're seeing?
Well, you've got the industry groups, and they want more flexibility. They're saying that if the standards are too strict, it'll actually hurt the whole hydrogen industry. Then you have the environmental advocates. They want really strict rules to make sure those tax credits are actually doing what they're supposed to, encouraging truly clean production and not just propping up fossil fuel-based hydrogen.
It sounds like the same old story trying to balance the economy with protecting the environment.
You got it. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as the hydrogen industry grows and new technologies come into play.
It makes you wonder what the Trump administration will do, considering their history with climate change.
Good point. It's definitely possible they might try to change or even get rid of those tax credits. That would have a big impact on clean hydrogen.
Something to keep an eye on for sure. Changing gears a bit, we also read about that research on climate change affecting glaciers in Svalbard.
Oh yeah, that was a fascinating one. Scientists are using all this cool tech like deep learning algorithms to analyze tons of images of those glaciers. They can track the changes over time really precisely.
I remember reading about calving front retreats, but I wasn't really sure what that meant. Can you explain it?
So think of a glacier like a giant river of ice, slowly moving towards the ocean. The calving front is where the glacier meets the water. As the glacier melts, that front moves further inland.
So it's like the glacier shrinking from the edges.
You got it. And the rate at which those calving fronts are retreating in Svalbard is pretty alarming. It's a clear sign that climate change is speeding up ice loss in those polar regions.
And what does that mean in the big picture? What happens when glaciers retreat like that?
Well, one big consequence is rising sea levels. As glaciers melt, they add more water to the oceans, which is obviously a threat to coastal communities all over the world.
Another reminder of how everything is connected. What happens in one place affects everyone else.
Exactly. And speaking of rising sea levels, there was another study about the U.S. mid-Atlantic coast that looked at how the seasonal cycle of sea level rise is changing because of climate change.
What did they find? Is it just rising faster?
It's a little more complicated than that. The study shows that both the lowest and highest sea levels are increasing a lot. That means the changes throughout the year are becoming more extreme. The highs are higher, and even the lows are higher, too.
So it's not a smooth increase, but more like a dramatic swing up and down throughout the year. What's causing that?
They think it has to do with changes in wind patterns near the coast. And those wind patterns are being affected by these larger climate change shifts.
So another example of how climate change messes with weather patterns in unpredictable ways.
Exactly. We need to think about these regional differences when we come up with strategies to adapt. One solution won't fit everywhere.
That makes sense. But aside from the scientific stuff, we also read about the challenges of communicating about climate change and how some groups are actively downplaying it. What stood out to you there?
There was one study that showed how sophisticated the tactics are that some industries use to promote climate denial and stall action. They focused on the fossil fuel, plastic, and agrochemical industries. It's all about using social media to push their message and create doubt.
So it's not just individual people being skeptical, but organized efforts to slow things down.
Yeah. The researchers found that these industries were using similar strategies to say that climate change isn't urgent, to question the science, and to push other stories that prioritize the economy over the environment.
It's pretty discouraging to see people working against progress on such a crucial issue. But there was also research on how to effectively counter climate denial. Well,
Yeah. There were some positive findings there, too. One study looked at this thing called compartmentalization. It's a way for people to hold on to beliefs that contradict each other by keeping them separate in their minds.
so someone could believe in climate change, but still justify doing things that contribute to the problem.
Exactly. They say that understanding this could help us communicate better. Instead of just throwing facts at people, we need to address those psychological roadblocks that prevent them from really getting it and taking action.
It's a really interesting point. Makes you realize how much psychology affects how we all process information,
Yeah.
especially on big emotional topics like climate change.
For sure. It shows we need more nuanced and empathetic ways to talk about climate change. It's about building trust, understanding people's values, and finding common ground so we can work together.
And along those lines, we also saw stories about communities taking action, even with all the communication challenges and political roadblocks. What were some of the hopeful examples?
One that comes to mind is Philadelphia. They've got this big program to plant thousands of trees in low-income neighborhoods that don't have a lot of green space. It helps with the urban heat island effect, but it also gets the community involved and promotes environmental justice.
That's a great example of a solution that does multiple things at once. It tackles climate change and makes life better for the residents, too.
Right. It's about realizing how these issues are all linked and coming up with creative ways to address them in a holistic way.
We also read about that cool project in Indonesia where they're using blockchain to fight deforestation.
Oh, yeah. That one's really innovative. They're basically building a transparent system to keep track of where palm oil comes from, which is a big cause of deforestation there. With blockchain, they can make sure the palm oil is produced sustainably and isn't contributing to destroying more forests.
It's amazing how technology can help us solve these environmental problems.
It really is. It shows the importance of working together and thinking outside the box. These solutions often come from unexpected places, with all sorts of people working together.
It's inspiring to see these communities doing their part and finding creative ways to make a difference. But switching back to politics, there have been some developments in the investigation into the Trump administration and how they handled January 6th.
Right. The House Select Committee just put out their final report. It details what they found and what they think should happen. It basically says that Trump and his people worked together to try to overturn the election and that he was responsible for the attack on the Capitol.
It's a scary reminder of how fragile our democracy is and how important it is to follow the rule of law.
Absolutely. And we still don't know what the long-term effects of all this will be, but it's clear that what happened on January 6th was a dark moment in our history.
We've covered a lot in this second part of our deep dive. We talked about clean hydrogen, melting glaciers, and communities taking action on climate change.
It's a complicated and constantly evolving issue, but we have to pay attention.
And we're back for the last part of our deep dive into all this climate news.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From the immediate impacts like those LA wildfires to those bigger trends like melting glaciers and rising seas.
And we talked about how tough it is to even talk about climate change with some groups actively trying to downplay it all.
But even with those challenges, we found some really inspiring stories of people and communities coming up with creative solutions.
It's been a bit of a roller coaster, but I feel like I have a much better grasp of just how complex all of this is. So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that climate change isn't something way off in the future. It's happening right now. We're seeing the effects everywhere, from extreme weather to changes in nature to the economic and social consequences that follow.
It's not just about the environment. It's about people's lives, their jobs, and the kind of future we're leaving for everyone who comes after us.
Exactly. It affects everything, and we need to be looking at it from all angles. We need to think about reducing emissions, adapting to the changes, coming up with new solutions, and most importantly, working together.
And that brings me back to that story from Indonesia. They're using blockchain to try and stop deforestation. It's amazing how technology can be used in such creative ways to tackle these big problems.
It shows how different fields can come together to make a difference. And it reminds us to think outside the box and bring different voices to the table.
Absolutely. And then we had those cities taking the lead, like Philadelphia and their urban tree planting program. It's not just about fighting the heat. It's about getting the community involved and making things fairer for everyone.
It's a great example of how climate action can actually make our communities better places to live, healthier, more resilient, and more equitable for all.
And all these local efforts are happening while we've got those big political debates and decisions being made that will shape our future. We've seen some good things, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the clean hydrogen tax credits, but there are also worries, like what might happen with the new Trump administration.
The political scene is always changing, so it's important to stay informed and involved. Our choices matter, like who we vote for and making sure those in charge are held accountable for their decisions.
It's not just about politics, though. It's about the choices we all make every day. What we buy, how we use energy, how we get around. It all adds up.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the size of the problem, but we have to remember that together we can make a real difference. Every little step counts.
It's about changing our mindset. We're not powerless. We can make things better. We can be the ones who create a better world for ourselves and future generations.
That's a great point to finish on. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay active. We all have a role to play in this.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into all the latest climate news. Until next time, keep exploring.